Hey everyone, welcome to the Anderson Bros Outdoors. I'm Jake, and today we're going to go over a beginner video of getting into RC crawling, so stay tuned. Hey everyone, welcome back. As I said, my name is Jake, and today we're going to try and cover the 101 of RC rock crawling. So, the video is going to be pretty lengthy. There's going to be a lot of stuff discussed. I'm going to try and stay on topic within many topics inside of or surrounding the RC rock crawling area, space, hobby, whatever you want to call it. So with that being said, you can see that I have this RC crawler behind me. I'm going to start with different organizations. So there's different organizations to do different type of competitions. Typically, when you want to get into RC crawling, it's because you want to do some sort of competition, go out and compete against your friends, potentially travel to a competition such as the We Rock competition in Colorado or the Apex competition at Disney, Oklahoma, which happens to also be the location for Crawlapalooza, Proline by the Fire. There's a bunch of different events with competitions in them. Now, those competitions follow different regulations. Regulations like SORCA, WRCCA, We Rock, things like that. Now, I'm not going to get into every single one of those. I think the most popular organizations are going to be the ones that I just listed. The most popular of those three is going to be SORCA. SORCA is a governing body for how trucks are built and comped. Now, there are four primary classes within the SORCA rules. There's Class 0, Class 1, Class 2, and Class 3. What does that mean? Well, Class 0 is basically like a truck that you would go buy off the lot. Think of it like a Jeep or a Toyota or a Ford. You would go to the dealer, you'd buy it, and you would take it out and you would run it in Colorado or Utah or, pick your favorite trail place. That would be considered Class 0. Now, Class 0 is not really specified within the SORCA rules. I think that there are rules somewhere for it. Class 1, 2, and 3 are more specifically outlined in the SORCA rules. Class 1 would be pretty much the same thing as Class 0, but you can run a little bit bigger tires. And there are different rules and regulations for each class. They're very strict and stringent. I will leave a link below to the SORCA Facebook page where you can download the SORCA rules and regulations. Now, a lot of the other local comps, such as the comp that I run, it has a subset of the SORCA rules. And we don't really follow 100% of them because to get all of the local people to do everything within those regulations, they wouldn't do it. So we want to make it more general so we get more participation. The idea of these rule sets is to make the competition fair. Now, you get a lot of people that want to bend the rules or maybe take advantage of every rule in the gray area, if you will. It makes competing not really fun because you have one person that's constantly winning or cheating to win. So the first thing we covered was the different rule sets and classes. You've got WRCCA, that's more of motor on axle, and we'll call them extreme cheater builds. You have SORCA rules, which is really the rules that you're going to follow most of the time when competing. This right here is an example of a Class 2 truck. And then you have the We Rock rules. We Rock are buggy rules, so there's a bunch of different competitions or classes, if you will, within the buggy world. Typically, that's something like you would see on hill killing or, where it's just a cage and it's not really a street legal car. Moving back into the classes for SORCA, Class 1 would be mostly stock truck with a little bit bigger tires, and it requires a driver, interior, things of that nature. Again, the rules are in the SORCA document that you can download from their Facebook page. Class 2 is a little more modified. So you take your truck, your Class 1 truck, and you add big tires. You cut the body some, you pinch the body, you bob the body. It has a lot more leeway. However, Class 2 is still technically supposed to be a street legal truck. So it should be something that you could drive on the road. Now, Class 3 is really the unlimited class. This is something that you would typically trailer to the trail. It doesn't have a title. 40-inch tires or larger. It has four-wheel steer, dig, things of that nature. The body is much more negotiable in terms of how big and wide and the dimensions of it need to be. That's typically where you're going to be, is you're going to be in the Sorka classes, either 0, 1, 2, or 3. And as I said, 0 is not really, doesn't have clear rules. The best thing that you can do for guidance on different classes is join your local groups. Maybe they have local Facebook pages, things of that nature, and they will tell you the rules that you need to follow when building a competition truck. Typically, Class 2 has the most participation. Class 1 is really, in my mind, a super try-hard class because it has the most rules, and a lot of people have to really try to build their truck to be super light and fit all of the rules. And then when you go to comp, most of the comps for Class 1 are really just a winch fest, meaning that you have a winch and you're winching almost all of the gates because the trucks aren't very capable. Class 2 is, like I said, the most common because it's the easiest class to build for. Class 3 is typically not as common because it requires four-wheel steer and a bunch of other things. And so Class 2 is really where you get a lot of participants. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the truck size itself. So there are things that you want to keep in mind. Now, when you download the rules, you'll see that for each class, there's a minimum gate width, meaning that the gates, tennis balls, cones, whatever they're using, they will be at least so many inches wide, such as Class 2, as an example, is 12-inch gates. So you don't want your track width to be 12 inches. You really don't want it to be 11 inches. You want to have enough room to squeeze through the gate, because they're not going to be laid out perfectly. I mean, the chances of you hitting one are going to be pretty high. That's the whole point of competitions. So whatever class you plan on running, make sure you look at the gate width minimum, so that way your truck is not too wide to run in that competition. I think most of the We Rock gates are 12 to 14 inches. You're really not going to see anything past 14 inches, except for, I think Class 3 in the circle rules is 16 inches. So you can have, a 14-inch wide truck and still get through the gates pretty easily. So what we just talked about was the track width, basically the width between the outside of the tire to the outside of the tire. The next thing I want to talk about is wheelbase. So essentially the length between the center of the wheel to the center of the wheel. I'm sure some of you are wondering, what's the perfect wheelbase? There's really no right answer to this. In the one-to-one world or the real world, where you're driving real scale Jeeps and Toyotas and things like that through trails, typically you want your wheelbase built off of the size of tire that you're running. So if you're running a 30-inch tire, you want a shorter wheelbase, or if you're running a 40-inch tire, you can get away with a little bit longer wheelbase because your breakover is not going to suffer. Meaning that as you expand the wheelbase and contract the wheelbase, this is the breakover. So getting over something like this would be your breakover angle. And really, you don't want your breakover angle to be too crazy, because then you're never going to get over any obstacles and you have to winch all the time. A good rule of thumb is Class 1, you're going to be around 11.5 to 12-inch wheelbase, because you're limited to a 4.19-inch tire. Class 2, you're limited to a 4.75-inch tire, and you're going to see around a 12 to 12.5-inch wheelbase there. And then Class 3, you can run 5-inch tires, so you'll see around a 13-inch, really between 13 and 14-inch wheelbase there. Buggies are no different, so typically, depending on the class, your wheelbase is going to depend or vary. Again, look at your local rules and regulations and get some help from your local group. I'm sure they would love to help you out and, get you to participate in the local events. All right, so we talked about classes, we talked about wheelbase and track width. Let's talk about some truck types. Now, you can buy a kit truck or you can buy an RTR truck. RTR simply means ready to run. Now, 9 times out of 10, really 10 times out of 10, if you're buying a ready to run truck, you're going to replace almost all of the electronics anyway. Typically, the electronics that come in every single RTR doesn't really matter the brand, outside of the Red Cat Fusion, which I probably wouldn't buy because the truck itself sucks, but the electronics are good in it. Outside of that specific example, almost every ready-to-run vehicle that you buy, you're going to replace the radio, the receiver, everything in it electronically. So it's often a better bet to purchase a kit and build it. And that way, first of all, you know how the kit goes together so you can maintenance it. Because you will want to maintenance it between competitions if that's what you're trying to do, because you would hate to go to a competition and have something minor happen and you lose the comp because that minor thing happened. Getting a kit will help facilitate your understanding of the truck. However, if you don't want a kit, you can purchase the RTRs. Like I said, there's the Red Cat Fusion, which I don't necessarily recommend, but it is an option. You also have the option of buying the Vanquish Stance. It's a ready to run. Those would be 2 Class 2 trucks. Now, for the Red Cat Fusion, you would have to find a bed or something to cover the back half of the truck in most Class 2 situations. But those are really the 2 Class 2 trucks that you can purchase that are ready to run. Other Class 2 kits would include the Vanquish VRD Carbon, Axial SCX10 Pro. I think Element has the Comp Fox kit. However, just know with a lot of the Element stuff, it is proprietary. So if you purchase it, you can't use like the normal AR44 diffs as an example. Just be on the lookout for that. Let's talk about different brands. What different brands are there? So typically there's a handful of different brands that you can purchase. As I've already named a few: Vanquish, Axial, Element, Traxxas. You can purchase the Traxxas TRX4 Sport or Sport Kit. Now, there are some things to keep in mind with each one of these. The biggest thing is, what are you going to use the truck for? If you're going to use the truck for simply a trail truck, meaning that you're going to take it out to hike with it and maybe do some hard obstacles, maybe not, but really just kind of putt around and have fun, then it doesn't really matter the brand that you purchase. They're all going to do that, and you're going to have fun with every single one of them. So there's no need to purchase one brand over the other for that specific purpose. The same thing can be applied for RTR versus kit. If you're going to be having fun with the truck and not necessarily seriously competing, an RTR is fine. However, 9 times out of 10, the kit is actually a better value, or it comes with better parts than the RTR would, because they have to save money from putting electronics in it. So the brand really doesn't matter unless you're comping, and then you're going to want to look for a few different things. Kits to look out for are the kits with the highest steering angle, so you can turn the wheels extreme one way or the other. There are rules to comping, right? We'll cover those real quick. It's like golf. You want the lowest score possible. Going through the gates gives you a -2 points, typically in most competitions or most rule sets. Doing a reverse, meaning going into reverse, each time you do that, you're adding a point. Hitting each gate is 10 points each, so if you hit both gates, you're at 20 points, and the points add up really, really fast. So you want to do everything to your truck that you can to maximize the performance of it, to make sure you're not hitting the gates, you're not doing reverses, you're not adding 5 points for winching, things of that nature. Now, depending on the course you're at, you have to winch, you might have to hit some gates, things of that nature, but you're trying not to. You're trying your hardest not to hit these gates. You're also trying your hardest to get the lowest score or the most negative score possible. The next thing I want to talk about is different scales. Scales as the size of truck. There are many different sizes of truck, and that's called the scale. For example, the smallest scale truck that you can buy is the 24 scale. So something like this. This is a micro crawler is what we'll call it. And these became extremely popular a couple of years ago, and now everybody has them. Personally, I'm not a huge fan of them because of how small they are. You have to really make them do crazy lines to emulate something like a 10th scale. So this would be a small scale, a mini, micro, whatever you want to call it. Then you have 10th scale, which would be something like this here. Then you have 8th scale. I don't have an example of the 8th scale, but it would be something like the new Helamon from Axial. And then finally you have 5th and 6th scale vehicles, which would be something like this SCX6, which would be massive. The difference between this 5th or 6th scale vehicle in terms of weight and that is about 20 pounds, give or take. So it is a huge difference. And it's something you really need to understand before you start really making your way into the RC rock crawling world. Now, the reason that I say it's something that you need to understand, because more often than not, people purchase something like this and they dive off the deep end with it. They buy, $1,000 to $2,000 worth of stuff for it. And then they realize that, hey, I don't necessarily prefer this. I prefer this size, or I prefer the 6 scale size. And so it's very beneficial to try many different scales before you really dive in head first on that specific scale. Because my personal preference may not be the same as yours. I prefer 10th scale because I think that's the funnest. But again, that's my preference. That may not be yours. So I would recommend hitting up your local groups and seeing if somebody has a truck you can borrow, or hitting up Facebook Marketplace and finding a cheap scale size that you want. And that way you can utilize it and not have a bunch of money invested in it. And if you don't like it, you can turn around and sell it the same as you bought it. So it's very beneficial to try out the different size trucks or different scale trucks before you purchase and start to really dive down that rabbit hole. Because again, you could waste a ton of money on a lot of stuff that you don't like and not even know it. The next thing we're going to talk about is electronics. I know that this subject's really overwhelming and there's a lot to go over, but if you stand back and really look at it, it's a relatively simple. There's not a lot that goes to it. It sounds like there is, but there's really not. So electronics wise, you have a radio and a receiver. An example of this is this tactical radio and this receiver. Now the receiver goes in the truck and it receives transmissions from your transmitter or your radio. 9 times out of 10, if you're purchasing an RTR, you're going to throw this away because the RTR electronics are less than adequate. They are not very fast and they don't have enough channels to support what you want to support most of the time. Sometimes it's okay. Now there are some really good options for relatively cheap on the market. One of them being a FlySky GT5. It's a 5-channel radio and they're relatively cheap. I think they're sub $100. Another one being a 6 or 8-channel Radio Link. Again, relatively cheap, and I think that they're sub $100. Personally, my recommendations for radios would be a Radio Master MT12, which requires a college degree to work because it's got a very steep learning curve, but it is an open source radio. They're $150 and the receivers are really cheap. If you're not into getting a degree for a radio, the other radio that I would recommend is the FlySky Noble NB4 Plus. I think they're $300. They are I think they're a 6 or 8 channel radio. And they are the fastest radio that you can buy right now, meaning that when you turn the wheel or you press the throttle, it has the fastest signal from the radio to the receiver, and it makes a huge difference. There's one thing that I want to talk about on these. All of your radios, you really need to do the research before you buy the radio, because not all receivers can go with all radios, even the same brand. So if you buy a FlySky radio, not all FlySky receivers will work for it. So you need to make sure that you do your due diligence, you do your research, and you figure out what receivers will work with that radio and vice versa before you actually make that commitment. Because if you're spending, $200, $300 plus, that is a pretty big commitment. So make sure that you make the right choice and you don't regret the radio that you buy. The next thing I want to talk about is servos. One of the staples of your truck. It's gonna turn your wheels. So it's gonna make your wheels go left or right. And there's gonna be about 4 different types of servos that I want to cover. So the first thing I want to talk about is the size of the servo. So this is a full-size servo. It is long from top to bottom. Now here I have a half-size servo, meaning that it's half the height of the full-size servo. So there's 2 different servo types. You need to be understanding of this because some trucks, you will run a half-size servo. So for example, if you're running a truck with a servo that sits behind the axle, you're going to want to run a half-size servo there because you don't want the servo to go down too far and potentially hit rocks and things of that nature. Now, if you have a chassis-mounted servo, meaning that the servo sits on the chassis and steers the truck, it doesn't really matter if it's half-size or full-size. It's really going to be weight dependent at that point. Now, the next thing I want to talk about is the powering of the servo. So you can see here there's only 1 wire coming out of this servo, meaning that it's powered by a beck. Now, a BEC is essentially a electronic device that powers your receiver or any other electronic on your truck. The BEC connects to the battery and then outputs to a servo, your receiver, things of that nature. Typically, you have a BEC built into your ESC. However, that is not always the case. There are ESCs out there like Castle Micro X2, and a lot of the drone ESCs do not have BECs built into them. So you either have to add a BEC or use an ESC with a BEC built in. Now, this servo requires a BEC. There are servos that have two outputs here. I don't have an example, unfortunately. One of the outputs, you have your little 3-wire plug. So you'll have a positive, a negative, and an input for the servo. And then the other wire coming out of here, if it's direct powered, will have a red JST plug. That will look like this. So there's two different types of servos. There's BEC powered, which is this guy, and then there's direct power, which would have a red JST plug coming out of it with the receiver plug. Typically, you'll want to go with direct power if you're using a full-size servo and you're going to stay in the 2 to 4S range. Now, one thing to keep in mind is to look at the servo output at different voltages. So direct power would be 2, 3, and 4S voltage. If you plan on running higher than 4S voltage, you're going to want to run a BEC powered servo because there's no servo on the market that can handle that kind of voltage. Now, BEC powered, you can actually run a Y splitter on these and buy a dedicated BEC for your servo. Now, there's instances where you will want to do that. For example, the brushed ESCs, they only have a 3 to 5 amp BEC, and typically on these crawler servos, you're going to want a 10 amp BEC. So if your ESC isn't capable of that, you will potentially get black and brownouts on your servo, meaning that your servo will stop working. There are other servo sizes as well. So for example, here we have a Micro Reefs 99. The next thing I want to talk about is winches, because they are essentially, a winch is essentially a servo that is not limited on steering. It just constantly turns one way or the other. Winches are the same way. There's half-size winches, there's full-size winches. There's winches that have an internal spool, meaning that the spool is completely covered by the winch body, and then there's external spools, meaning that the spool is wide open and you have to create a guide for it to make sure that the line stays on it. They come in full-size, half-size, and you can buy mini winches, so this Reefs Micro 99 can actually be a winch. And that's really just going to depend on your needs, the winch placement, things of that nature. Just know that you'll want to make sure that your radio can handle a winch, and some of these winches are very powerful. So you'll want to make sure that you can moderate the speed of the winch, because if it goes full bore all the time and you won't go to get the winch tucked into your fairlead, you could rip out your fairlead or break your winch line, things of that nature, and you're not going to be very happy about it. The other servos that you can utilize are for shifting different things such as dig, opening and closing diffs. Now the Traxxas TRX4 axles, they come with locking or unlocking diffs, so you'll use a micro servo to do that. So servos aren't just for steering or winching. You can use them for a variety of other things. The next thing we're going to talk about is ESCs. So the ESC is the device that connects to the battery and powers the motor. So here is an example ESC, and it is an electronic speed control. It really just controls the speed of the motor. It plugs into your receiver the same way a servo would, and then it plugs into your motor. So in this instance, it plugs into this brushed motor. This is a ready-to-run takeout spectrum system. Still has the servo in it. So your ESC is going to be very critical on choosing the right one. There are a myriad of different ones out there. There's two key things to know when choosing ESC. What motor you're going to run, either brushed or brushless, and two, is that motor censored or uncensored? You pick the motor that you want to run, and then you pick the ESC based upon that motor. If you buy a censored motor and you run it in censorless mode, it's probably not going to have the performance that you want. Now, the thing to keep in mind here is that you're really probably not going to buy a brushed motor. You will very likely buy a brushless motor. Now, the most common motor used in the crawling world today is the 2-in-1 series. So Spectrum and Hobbywing make these motors. I think Holmes Hobby has one in development as well. And basically what it is it's a motor and ESC all in one package to eliminate a lot of the complexity, eliminate a lot of the wires, and make everything lighter. These motors work just fine. The issue with some people is they don't want that much weight. So they'll run something like an airplane motor or a drone motor, and it's called an outrigger, meaning that the outside of the motor turns instead of the inside of the motor. See, this is an in-runner motor. When you turn the shaft, the inside of the motor spins. Now for an outrunner, this would be an outrunner motor. You can see the outside of the motor spins as you turn the shaft. It's really going to depend on your weight, what motor you want to run, things of that nature, as to what ESC you buy. Again, there are many different options out there. Personally, I have a lot of the Rhino ESCs. If I'm going to use a direct power servo, I run the 40 amp ESC. If I need a Beck powered servo, I'll run the 80 amp ESC. The 40 amp Rhino only has a 4 or 5 amp Beck, and the 80 amp Rhino has a 8 or 10 amp Beck. And so depending on the truck and the need for that truck, that's the ESC that I run. Now note, the Rhino ESCs are drone ESCs, and they are not waterproof, and they'll only run sensorless motors. They will run sensored motors, but it will not run it very well because it's made for sensorless, brushless motors. You cannot run brushed motors with them. With that being said, we'll talk about motors. Again, there's two different types of motors. Well, really three different types of motors. There's brushed, brushless, in-runner, outrunner. It's pretty simple. There's a whole lot of different brands. There's a whole lot of different sizes. So you're going to have, in the brushed world of motors, you're going to go based off of turn. The lower the turn, the faster it goes. The higher the turn, the slower it goes. So you're going to really want to buy the motor based off of how fast, or really all of your gearing within your transmission and your diffs. And then for the brushless motors, it goes based off of KV. Holmes Hobby has a really good brushed to brushless conversion chart. Typically, in a lot of the crawlers, you're going to be between 1,000 and 3,000 kV. You have a lot more range, throttle range for brushless than you do brushed. And so I just run brushless and everything. The next thing I want to talk about is batteries. So batteries is not necessarily a huge item in crawling. Typically in a trail truck, you'll have a larger battery, such as a 5,000 milliamp battery. If you're doing competitions, you can have as small a battery as 800 milliamps. So I typically run 1,500 to 2,000 milliamp batteries in all of my stuff, trail running or not. I just take 4 or 5 batteries with me. It allows me to have a couple of dead batteries, or batteries die, because they will. You'll lose a cell or two and you'll not be able to use the battery. You'll have to throw it away or recycle it. A couple of things with batteries. Everything is moved to lithium, and it can be quite dangerous. Meaning you're going to want to keep batteries in some sort of fireproof box, whether that be a ammo can or a special battery bag. You're going to want to do that because it could potentially explode and burn your house down. It has happened on more than one occasion to more than one person. So be cognizant of that. Make sure that when you're traveling with the batteries, they're in that bag or in that can. You really don't want to lose your car, your house, or your life because you didn't have your batteries in a bag. Now, with that being said, you need to be very careful with these batteries in terms of charging them. That means if you buy a breadboard, meaning that you have a charging board with way more than one battery slot in it, you never want to charge more than one battery at a time. If your charger has the ability to charge 2 different batteries, you can charge 2 different batteries, but make sure you're not charging 2 batteries on the same channel. Can you do it? Yes, you can do it. However, it is extremely risky. If those batteries aren't exactly the same voltage, the cells aren't the same voltage, when you plug them in, you can have a surge of extreme amperage traversing through your breadboard and into your batteries, and it can be a bad day. Again, it can catch fire. I can't stress enough how important it is to utilize good battery safety. You will have a bunch of different options and brands in terms of batteries and chargers. An example is, here is a Spectrum battery. It has the balance plug built into the balance board I would not recommend buying Spectrum batteries because you will have to buy the Spectrum charger. This battery doesn't have a balance plug in it. For the lithium batteries, when you're charging the battery, you have to have this balance plug and the plug. What this balance plug does is it makes sure that every single cell is getting the appropriate voltage. If you're not getting the appropriate voltage and you just plug this in and start charging it and one cell gets way more voltage than the other, that's when things really start to get bad. Most batteries have balance plugs on them, regardless of the brand. Just be aware that when you're buying batteries, that Spectrum specifically, you can't do that. You have to buy the Spectrum charger because this balance plug is actually a balance board built in here, and this third little hole in the plug is a proprietary communication to the charger to tell it what that balance board is doing. Like I said, there's many options. It's really just going to depend on what you're going to do with that truck. If you're going to run a trail truck, this battery is adequate. If you're going to run a comp truck, you would want to run a smaller battery or something like this. Again, you can get them in different sizes. I use Z batteries. You can get two 1500 Z batteries on Amazon for 30 bucks. Links in the description below. I will also link my charger in the description below. The charger, again, you can buy any brand that you want. I would stay away from Traxxas and Spectrum because those two chargers aren't adequate for, they're more like prosumer, right? They're not something that's going to be, that you're going to want to use for charging, or really once you get a good understanding of how all of this works. If there's two things that I would research until I couldn't research anymore, it would be the radio and it would be the charger. Batteries are relatively cheap, but radios and chargers, you're going to want to buy once, cry once. So that kind of leaves us with the rest of the truck, and the rest of the truck being like different parts and things of that nature. So the first thing we'll talk about is wheels and tires. So there's going to be three wheel sizes, four, I guess, if you're talking about 6 scale as well. There's going to be 4 wheel sizes. There's going to be 1.55 wheels. Those are going to be on your class 1/class 0 trucks. They're going to be really scale. 1.5 would be like a 15-inch wheel in real life. You'll have 1.9-inch wheels, which would be like 19s in real life. These are probably the most common wheels. You can buy them anywhere. You can buy them on Amazon. You can buy them from many different manufacturers: Spec RC, Locked Up RC, Vanquish, Axial. I mean, there's wheels for days out there, and there's a lot of licensed wheels. Again, it's going to depend on the class you're in. To what wheels that you run. You can get 2.2s, which would be like a 22-inch wheel, and I think those probably look the best personally, but you know, it is what it is. These are 1.9-inch wheels right here, and they are actual licensed method wheels. These are 310 methods from Vanquish in a Cerakoted red, white, and blue color. And then the final wheel size is 2.9-inch. And these will be on your SCX6, so they're really kind of limited to the one platform. However, all of the other wheels, 1.5, 1.9, and 2.2, they have 8mm hexes, and you can switch them through almost all of your different trucks. Just be cognizant when running these different wheels, there are differences in the wheels, meaning that typically in the crawling world, you have bead locks. In the racing world, you glue your tires to your wheel. So you get a buggy like this, these tires are glued to the wheel. Now that's really not the case on most crawlers. Here's an example of a beadlock wheel. So the ring comes off the front, the ring comes off the rear, and you have a clamp ring, which would be one of these. And the clamp rings are different sizes, widths, and weights. So like this is a centered clamp ring and it's very heavy. This is a plastic clamp ring and it's very light. You have brass ones. But one thing to note is the different width. So different wheels will come with different clamp ring sizes, so you need to be cognizant of that when you're purchasing. Like this right here is a stock plastic wheel, and in order to take the tire off, you do have to take these out. Now some wheels come like this wheel here with a bunch of different screws in the front. You really need to pay attention to the wheels that you buy because this wheel specifically has 6 screws in the back to remove the tire from the wheel. Some wheels do not have these quick access screws, meaning you have to take every single one of these screws out of the beadlock ring to get the tire off. Now, that's not a big deal if the tire is going to stay on there permanently or for a very long time. However, if you actively change tires out of a set of wheels, you're going to want to buy a set of wheels that has quick change screws. So this would be a 3-piece wheel. You have a piece in the back that connects to this piece in the front, And then you have your beadlock ring, which would be the third piece. 3-piece wheel. Main piece, ring 1, ring 2, that would be the third ring. These are 2-piece wheels, meaning that they are beadlocks. These are plastic, Vanquish licensed KMC wheels, and they have the quick access screws on the back so you can remove it. A lot of your ready to runs are not going to have true beadlock wheels, meaning that a lot of the ready runs are just going to have tires glued onto wheels. When you're purchasing wheels, make sure you get the ones that you want. Here's another example of a 2-piece wheel. In order to get the tire off the wheel, you have to take these 6 screws out of the hub, and the wheel simply comes apart, and you can pull the clamp ring out. This is what a tire would look like. You simply put the clamp ring in place like such, and the tire will have a lip on it, this lip here, and it will sit inside of the clamp ring so it gets squeezed between the 2 halves of the wheel. And that is how the bead stays on and doesn't actually get removed. So wheels, many different brands, many different variety. These are all 1.9 examples. However, you can stretch the 2.2 wheels in here and stretch the tire over them. You obviously can't put 1.9 inch wheels on 2.2 inch tires, but you can put the 2.2 inch wheels in 1.9 inch tires. Be careful on the tires that you purchase because there are limits to each class. For example, this is a 4.9 inch tire. You cannot run this in class 1 or class 2. This is a 4.75 inch tire. You can run this in class 2, but not class 1 or class 3. This is a 4.19 inch tire. You can run this in class 1, and that's it. Be cognizant of the wheels and tires that you're buying. And the next thing we'll talk about are tires. So this is an example of a BF Goodrich tire. It is a licensed tire made by Proline. Proline comes with different compounds. You get G8 and you get Predator. Your tire compound, tread type, whatever, is going to depend on your area. The rule of thumb is to ask the group what's the best tires to get and purchase those tires because that's what's going to make you competitive. They all have different compounds. Here is a Yokohama Vanquish tire. This is in red compound. It is a very soft compound. This is a G8 compound, and it is a harder compound than the Vanquish Red. These are Voodoo tires, and these are soft compound, and they're about the same as the G8s. And then here are some more G8 Maxxis Proline tires, and they're the same compound as these. So, tires, there's many different brands, many different types. You're going to use different compounds for different weather conditions, warm, cold, wet, dry, things of that nature. It's going to depend on your local area. Some rocks are super slick, some rocks are real abrasive. It's, like I said, reach out to your local community and see what works best for them. I know this is a long video, I'm sorry, bear with me. The next thing I want to talk about is bodies. So you bought a truck, whether it's a kit or an RTR, and you want to put a different body on it. Typically, when you want to put a different body on there, you need to be cognizant of the wheelbase and the class that you're in. For example, Sorca Class 1, you are required to be within a certain distance of the center of the wheel well of that body. So if that body is an 11.8 inch body, wheelbase, meaning that the center of the wheel well to center of the wheel well on the front and rear is 11.8 inches, you're pretty much going to be stuck to that specific mark in Class 1. So if you want to run 12 or 13 inch wheelbase, in your Class 1, you're going to have to get a body that supports that. There are many different types of body. There's a Lexan body. So this is Lexan here. It is essentially Lexan, like the name suggests. Lexan is going to be the most typical, so it's going to look like something like this. It's also going to be the lightest. You have injection molded bodies, which would be something like this cage is injection molded plastic. However, the whole body is injection molded. This RC four-wheel drive body right here is injection molded. And then you're going to have 3D printed bodies. If you're doing competitions, you're likely only going to run Lexan or injection molded. 3D printed, it's a huge gray area. A lot of organizations won't touch those bodies for a variety of reasons. So unless you're just doing it for fun and trailing, I probably would run either Lexan or injection molded. Some of the best brands of injection molded bodies that you can buy are RC 4-wheel drive and Tamiya. There are other brands such as Endura, things of that nature, but the Tamiya and RC 4-wheel drive have the best components that go with and the best complete kits with instructions on those bodies. They're relatively cheap. I think the most expensive body kit for like the RC 4-wheel drive 4Runner is like just under $200. However, you can get body kits for $100 to $150. So mounting the body is going to be completely different. Just going to depend on the truck. Like for example, you can purchase the -G Class 1 truck and it comes with sliders that you can mount the body to, kind of like that truck there. So do some research on the body that you want to run. Typically, you'll want to build the truck around the body, and the body comes from the class. So there's a bunch of different ways you can mount it, do things, but there's also a bunch of different options out there. The more research you do, the less money you're going to waste. The next thing we're going to talk about are shocks. All RTR shocks leak out of the box, typically. The only ones that I found that don't are the Traxxas TRX4 shocks. They're probably the best shocks that you get with the ready to run or a kit. All of the other kits or ready to runs that I've purchased have leaky shocks. That's just part of it. There's really two different shock types. There is your external coil or coilover shock type, and then your internal coil. You know, it's a shock with a spring inside of the body. An example of this are your coilover shocks in the rear, which these are specifically Traxxas 2660s. And then I have Desert Lizard's internal coiled shocks in the front. The reason for this is on a dedicated comp truck, typically you'll want to have your internal sprung shocks in the front to keep the front sucked in when you're doing a climb like this. And that keeps the truck from unloading. When it unloads, the chassis separates from the axle, meaning it goes this way, and it basically makes your center of gravity higher. It makes your probability of falling back on itself higher in return. 90 to 100 millimeter Desert Lizards in the front, and I'll run the Traxxas 2660s on the rear. For a trail truck or a non-competition truck, it doesn't really matter. You can run whatever you want, wherever you want, however you want. Shock oil is typically between 10 and 80 weight. However, if you're running a really heavy truck, you can also run CST, which is like diff fluid. You can run up to 10K CST. Typically, I have 3 to 5K CST or diff fluid in a lot of my scale trucks. So there is that. The last thing I want to talk about are other miscellaneous parts, transmission, lights, electronics, things like that that aren't necessarily a requirement for crawling, but are add-ons. Transmissions are obviously a requirement for crawling. You're typically going to run the one that comes with the truck. So for example, you have this piece in here. This is the trans, and the trans drives the truck. Typically you're going to run whatever the truck comes with. However, there are other options as well. You can run 3 gears, and in order to change the trans, you have to change the skid out. But again, research, videos, things of that nature, it will show you. Lights are the same way. You can actually purchase electronics that are like relays that will plug into your receiver and power your lights, so you can turn them on and off with a button on your radio. So something like one of these buttons here would turn lights on or off, or holding it would turn lights on until you let go and turn them off. There's a lot of really fun and cool things that you can do to your vehicles. The options and stuff are limitless. So I would highly recommend you get out there, get on Instagram, get on Facebook, get on YouTube, and you'll see a bunch of different things that you'll want to try, which kind of leads me to closing. I cannot stress enough how important it is to try different scales. You may really like the micro scale, you may really like the 10 scale. I would not invest a bunch of time and money into one of them until you know for sure that that is something that you're going to want to do. This is a hobby and you're supposed to have fun. This isn't a full-time job. This isn't something that you go and you do and you get mad because you lose, or you have a worse truck than somebody else, or somebody else has a more expensive truck. Nobody cares. If your truck's better than mine, that's cool. I'm just out there to have fun. I want to do crazy climbs, do crazy trails. I want to enjoy the people that I'm around. And that's really what it's about. So don't get caught up in the technical details. Don't get caught up in the, all of the other stuff. It'll come with time and experience. Enjoy the hobby. Make sure that it's something that you want to do, because it can become very expensive very quickly. With that being said, we really appreciate you making it this far. Huge shout out to the TABO club members. And as always, we hope you have a great day.